of the British flag. The city is home to the Bank of England, the Royal Exchange, the London Stock Exchange, the Royal Courts of Justice, and many other financial and legal institutions. National City Bank of New York was originally just called Citibank, as was its sister, the Citibank of Cleveland. They both became national banks in 1865 when they received charters to print U.S. national currency. This was the same year that Lincoln, who had been issuing his own currency, the greenback, was assassinated. What was the difference between the greenbacks that Lincoln printed during the Civil War and the national currency banks like Citibank printed in their place? Banks had been printing a muddled variety of currencies as long as there had been banks in the U.S. Paper currency was ostensibly backed by some amount of gold or silver and loaned out at interest. After the Civil War, many large banks were allowed to issue a national currency for the first time. This was a big step toward the elite's goal of recreating a national central bank. Lincoln's greenbacks, on the other hand, were issued by the Treasury and were interest-free. The greenback threatened to cut the banks out of the whole currency racket. They killed him for it. Only one other president in U.S. history has tried to issue interest-free Treasury notes. They killed him too. America in the mid-19th century was marked by rapid western expansion, and that meant railroads. In the decade between 1860 and 1870, over 20,000 miles of track were laid, linking east to west and providing a way to move grain and cattle from the middle of the continent to the growing cities. All of this development required capital. Investors were more than willing to make loans, not just to turn a profit, but to get their foot in the door of the exploding American economy. The Rothschilds were no exception. In fact, they were pioneers in the financing of railroads on the other side of the Atlantic. Another Rothschild associate got in on the ground floor of one of America's first railroads, the B&O, a man by the name of George Peabody. Peabody was taken under the Rothschild wing in the 1830s and opened an office in London. He quickly became the go-to guy for British investors interested in American ventures and dealt in U.S. and state bonds, canals, transatlantic cable and railroads, and even shipped steel to the U.S. for laying track. But Peabody and Company's involvement in the American Railroad would really shift into high gear after Peabody retired and turned his company over to his partner, Junius Morgan, in 1864. The company was renamed J.S. Morgan and Company, and Junius' son, John Pierpont Morgan, backed by unlimited Rothschild funds, would become the most powerful banker in the United States. Not only is the Morgan name familiar to every American, so is his likeness. Alexander Brown was a linen merchant who emigrated to Baltimore from Ireland in 1800, becoming very successful. He was a major stockholder in the Second National Bank of the United States, along with Girard and Astor, and his sons would go on to found one of the largest merchant banks in America. Brown Brothers had a London branch as well, Brown Shipley and Company. The Browns have always had close ties to the Bank of England. In fact, it is an unwritten rule that the bank's Board of Governors must always include a Brown Shipley director. One of them, Lord Montague Norman, served as governor of the Bank of England longer than anyone in history. If you guessed that the Browns enjoyed close ties to the Rothschilds, you would be correct. In fact, it was through George Peabody's connections with the Brown family that he was first welcomed into the Rothschild circle. Undoubtedly, the Rothschilds' closest allies were two German banking families, the Schiffs and the Warburgs. The Warburg family name is legendary in banking. M. Warburg and Company, based in Hamburg, is the oldest bank in the world and remains in private hands. The Schiff family shared a house with the Rothschilds in Frankfurt, the very house that Nathan and his brothers grew up in. Jacob Schiff first came to America after the Civil War, and in 1875 went to work for Kuhn, Loeb and Company. He promptly married co-founder Solomon Loeb's daughter Therese and took over the bank. Paul Warburg, who is regarded as the architect of the Federal Reserve System, followed in Jacob Schiff's footsteps, first marrying Solomon Loeb's other daughter Nina, and then joining Kuhn and Loeb when he too came to America in 1902. Warburg was chairman of his own bank, the Bank of Manhattan, and sat on the boards of many important companies, often together with Schiff. Before Warburg came to join him in New York, though, Jacob Schiff spotted two promising entrepreneurs and lent them his support. One would become the undisputed king of oil, the other, America's preeminent railroad baron, John D. Rockefeller and Edward H. Harriman. Rockefeller was pious,
hard-working, and ruthless. He and his brother William formed Standard Oil together, and by buying out or forcing out competitors, the company at one time controlled 90% of the refining business in the U.S. Harriman was no slouch either. He would eventually control the Union Pacific, the Southern Pacific, the Illinois Central, and a few other lines, as well as the Wells Fargo Express. He also sat on the board of National City Bank of New York, along with Schiff. Jacob Schiff arranged the financing for both the Harriman and Rockefeller empires, either through Kuhn and Loeb or National City Bank of Cleveland. The Rockefellers dabbled in banking too. William Rockefeller and his son Percy were both directors at National City Bank of New York, and William's grandson James would one day be chairman. The bank best known as a Rockefeller Bank, though, was Chase, which was built up by John D. Rockefeller's son. Eventually, Chase would merge with Paul Warburg's bank to become Chase Manhattan, after which J.D. Rockefeller's grandson David would become chairman there. Oddly, these two New York banks were considered rivals, despite the fact that they were run largely by the same family. If the Rockefellers had a rival, it would have been Morgan. J.P. Morgan pioneered the merger. He financed Thomas Edison's company and merged it with another electric company to form General Electric. He bought Andrew Carnegie's Steel Corporation and combined it with others to create U.S. Steel. In the early 1900s, Morgan and his companies controlled $1 billion in assets, an incredible sum at the time. Which is why there was universal surprise when it was discovered upon Morgan's death that the worth of his estate was only around $70 million. A lot of money in those days, but nothing like what he was believed to be worth. The truth is, he was playing with someone else's money half the time. Morgan, like the rest of these players, was one brick in a financial pyramid, the top tier of which was occupied by the Rothschilds. With the addition of a few other bit players, this pyramid is a pretty good representation of the cartel that would form the Federal Reserve in 1913. But first, there would be a war. The similarities between the Spanish-American War and the war in Iraq are uncanny. Both happened around the turn of the century. Both were preceded by a well-coordinated propaganda campaign. Both were won quickly, but were followed by a long and painful occupation period. The U.S. was bogged down for years in the Philippines fighting insurgents. The death tolls of both invading U.S. troops and local civilians are eerily similar. Finally, both wars were based on a lie, and initially supported by an American public which had been duped. While the robber barons were consolidating their control over American industry, several politicians, a Navy admiral, a newspaperman, and a lawyer were beating the war drum, pushing the U.S. toward war with Spain, which still held possessions in the Caribbean. You might think of them as the neoconservatives of 100 years ago. A couple of these men are worth taking a quick look at. The leader of this group was Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt helped drum up support for war with fiery speeches, while he and Elihu Root led a campaign to modernize the U.S. Navy. Root was Secretary of War at the time under McKinley, and Roosevelt became Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897. If you were wondering if these men were connected in any way to the bankers and tycoons we've been talking about, Elihu Root was their lawyer. He personally handled the legal affairs of J.P. Morgan, E.H. Harriman, and other powerful men, constantly running back and forth between Washington and New York. The Spanish were no saints, and an independence movement had sprung up in Cuba. The rebellion became more belligerent with U.S. backing, and Spain responded by throwing Cubans into relocation camps. William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper mogul, ran stories vilifying the Spanish and their abuses. Reportedly, an artist he had sent to Cuba to record the alleged crisis wired back, saying there was nothing to draw. Hearst famously replied, "You provide the pictures, I'll provide the war." In 1898, the USS Maine was sent to Cuba to keep an eye on things. 3 weeks later, an explosion sent the Maine, along with 260 American sailors, to the bottom of Havana Harbor. Spain was blamed and the U.S. declared war. Spain's wooden ships were no match for the newly modernized U.S. Navy, and the war was over within months. The U.S. took possession of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Cuba was given limited independence, but the U.S. kept Guantanamo Bay for itself. As it turned out, Spain had nothing to do with the sinking of the Maine. It's unclear if the explosion was a simple onboard accident or if the ship was intentionally sunk to get the war started. Either way, with its victory over the Spanish, America entered the new century as a world power.
President McKinley was re-elected in 1900 with Teddy Roosevelt as his running mate. McKinley, who had resisted going to war, was barely into his second term 6 months when he was assassinated. Teddy Roosevelt assumed the presidency. Now the bankers, with their sights set on a central bank, had almost all of their ducks in a row. With allies in control of both American government and industry, only one thing stood in their way: the attitudes of the American public. Americans had become fearful of the great power that was being amassed in the hands of a few wealthy men. This was compounded when Harriman and Morgan, who had been fighting over control of the Northern Pacific Railroad, decided to set aside their differences and form a large trust. The Northern Securities Company, which Rockefeller got a piece of as well, combined several northern railroads under one umbrella. Teddy Roosevelt decided to attack both Northern Securities and Standard Oil for antitrust violations. These lawsuits culminated in the breakup of both monopolies. In 1907, while all of this trust busting was going on, there was a financial panic started by a run on the Knickerbocker Trust Company. J.P. Morgan intervened and saved the nation from a crash. What few realized was that before Morgan stepped in to stop the panic, he helped create it. Doctor of Law and author Ellen Brown described the panic and its significance aptly. The Panic of 1907 was triggered by rumors that two major banks were about to become insolvent. Later evidence pointed to the House of Morgan as the source of the rumors. The public, believing the rumors, proceeded to make them come true by staging a run on the banks. Morgan then nobly stepped in to avert the panic by importing $100 million in gold from his European sources. The public thus became convinced that the country needed a central banking system to stop future panics, overcoming strong congressional opposition to any bill allowing the nation's money to be issued by a private central bank controlled by Wall Street. This was all well understood at the time by some. In 1913, House Representative Charles Lindbergh Sr. stated into the congressional record, "The money trust caused the 1907 panic and thereby forced Congress to create a National Monetary Commission." The National Monetary Commission was formed to study ways to stabilize the U.S. financial system. The commission finally made its recommendation after traveling around Europe for 2 years on the country's tab. What the country really needed was, can you guess? A central bank. Which is no surprise. The commission's leader, the powerful senator from Rhode Island, Nelson Aldrich, held shares in New York's biggest banks. His daughter Abby married John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Yes, Nelson Aldrich was David Rockefeller's grandfather. What about Teddy Roosevelt? Where did his loyalties lie? Roosevelt, like his fifth cousin Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was from a wealthy Dutch family who were connected by marriage to the Astors. The Roosevelt, Delano, and Astor families literally intertwined like threads in a rug. Like the Astors, the Roosevelts held large tracts of land in Manhattan, which Teddy's great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Claus van Roosevelt, purchased back when New York was still a Dutch colony. Roosevelt was known to be a Morgan man, was friends with Edward Harriman, and had accepted campaign contributions from Rockefeller. Both Roosevelt and his longtime friend and Secretary of State, Elihu Root, helped further the agenda of the money trust in many ways. So if Roosevelt was on the side of the bankers, why did he attack Standard Oil and Northern Securities? There is only one reasonable